All right, fantastic. So we've got it recording. And yeah, there's, I know a bunch of people who'd like to learn how to use this program or understand what this all means, this new phase of Weed Out the Risk. And so you can certainly send along this recording to any of your colleagues who might be interested in learning more about it as well. So I'm not sure if you have facilitated Weed Out the Risk before, if it's a module you're familiar with. Um, Obviously it depends as well on your client's age range, because if you predominantly work with folks who are older than 19, Weed Out the Risk may have just seemed a little bit more juvenile previously, in just the aesthetic and some of the language and the text and things like that. It's catered for youth. So what we've tried to do here with this iteration is expand it to a more adult audience, but you're still going to see a handful of pages that are similar to the previous Weed Out the Risk program. Now, if you're not familiar with what I'm talking about and what Weed Out the Risk is, it was designed in 2014, and then in 2018, when cannabis became legal, it expanded across the country with the help of Mad Canada to be delivered in high schools across the country, educating youth on the risks of cannabis impaired driving. Now, although the focus is on cannabis and driving, a lot of the tools and strategies that are learned by the participants from this session are also going to be usable in a variety of other sort of contexts. For example, alcohol impaired driving, or even opioid impaired driving, or any sort of impairment. It's the same principles, the same lessons can be used with multiple, types of impairment. So, yeah, that's kind of the whole premise of it. And it follows a lot of the same rhythm that you may have been familiar with other hub modules. So, for example, with other hub modules, you would provide the participants with a booklet, which we can send off to you if you want to start delivering the program. And that booklet includes space to respond to journal items that you're going to see come up here. So we'll have like a question, and they can write the answer to that question in their journal. And that's something that they keep with them. So this is, same kind of concept, same principles, same patterns that you're seeing from other hub modules. So we will begin. As we go through, I'll explain a little bit about each page, its value, how you'd facilitate it as a facilitator. And yeah, feel free to interrupt at any point if you have any questions. And as I mentioned, we still are in the development phase, though we're at the very tail end, and it should launch next week. If there are any points at all where you have questions or concerns, or something doesn't make sense, please feel free to put in your input. Even if you just have, input on the way things look, or, any sort of opinions. This is kind of an opportunity for us to gather some feedback from our clients, or, the folks delivering, what you think of the program. So all feedback is welcome, and really important to making any sort of necessary adjustments at the tail end of the development process. All right, so we're going to start with explaining what Weed Out the Risk is trying to achieve. And so the three things that we want to have as outcomes for this, or what we're going to explore in this module, is how cannabis affects someone's ability to drive, the social legal consequences of cannabis impaired driving, and how to prevent cannabis impaired driving. So we'll start with a check-in, and this is really important to do, especially if you're in a group setting, if you're, delivering to multiple participants. So what do you already know about cannabis? And this is really important for participants to, share what their baseline knowledge is, and help them feel comfortable with you. Give them a sense that this whole, hour that you would deliver this workshop, it's meant to be done in an hour, that this whole session is going to be founded on, discussion and discourse and back and forth, and it's not really a one-way stream of conversation. And so this is kind of that first element where we're saying, share with me what you know. One of the really valuable things that I find happens at this first question is you might hear some myths, some things that come up, that are just frankly like untrue, are myths around cannabis or cannabis and driving. And this is an opportunity for you to, get that sense of what their knowledge level is about it. And so you can tailor the workshop to better meet their level of understanding on the topic. Obviously, if you had a respondent say, I really don't know much, then you're going to kind of start from the bottom. So rules of engagement. So thank you for sharing what you know. Now let's brainstorm some rules of engagement. So rules of engagement are, this is, I find, a very important slide when you might have a particularly opinionated group that you're working with. If they're really outspoken, then sometimes it's important that they are just making sure that they're being respectful towards others, being sensitive to the fact that this is a conversation that can deeply affect someone. For example, you're talking about something that, does involve kind of life and death, and it can be touchy for folks. So if you have someone who's very cavalier about driving high, which a lot of people are, to be respectful of the fact that there could also be somebody else in the room who's lost someone they loved or been in a crash due to cannabis impaired driving or just impaired driving in general. So, to be cognizant of other experiences in the room, that would be an example of a rule of engagement. So allow them to fill in that blank of what are some rules of engagement. We put in some suggestions here, and these are some things you can say if they're not really sure how to fill that in. Next, we have our first workbook moment. So this is an opportunity for self-reflection. Answer the workbook question in a way that best suits you. So you can write down your answer, you could draw a picture, and then share once you're finished what you came up with. So the first workbook question is what matters? So they're going to turn to their workbooks, and if you don't have a workbook, which I know you don't, you could just do like, ask them to bring into the session a little journal or some sort of book they would already have, and fill this in. So what do you value most? Now, I know there's two questions here. Really try to focus on just, saying, or having them answer just the first one first and thinking that, you know, and then once they've completed that answer and expressing it, we'd move on to the second one. So how do you think these things could be impacted by the repercussions of cannabis impaired driving? And the reason why we really want to take a long pause between these two is we don't want the answer of the second question to influence their answer to the first. So traditionally, what kind of answers we would receive in the first one of what do you value most? A lot of participants would put in things like the people that they care about, um, or their job, their source of income, family, friends, those sorts of things are the typical things. So the next question of how do you think these things could be impacted by the repercussions of cannabis impaired driving? Of course, this depends on, the repercussions of cannabis impaired driving is very vague. It could be a collision, it could be a charge. Um, there's all sorts of different outcomes that can happen with impaired driving. But this is to really give them a sense that what they value most could be affected by this decision, which is something that they might not have put together first. And at this point in the session, because we're at the very beginning, their answer to that might be it wouldn't be impacted. And if that's where they start, that's fantastic because that means they need the workshop and that what you're about to say in the next few slides is going to be more important than ever. So if they were to answer that second question, like, I don't think the things that I value would be impacted at all, then this is a great place to move along from. So the goals in the program using harm reduction, weed out the risk, is trying to reduce impaired driving, increase good decision making by cannabis users, and increase road safety, right? All pretty easy things to get on board with. We want it to be clear for participants that we're not in the business of being anti-cannabis or, having any sort of like agenda in that sense. It's strictly about, increasing road safety. If people choose to use, there's no judgment on that. It's about, can you choose to use safely? Yes. Here are some, harm reduction strategies, which we'll go through in this session, about how someone can use cannabis safely. And that's a really, important part. If, there's not judgment on using cannabis, but it's, making sure that if you do choose to use, you're planning your night ahead so that you're not going to be in a position where you might need to drive. And reducing impaired driving, of course. All right, so let me know if this video doesn't work. But we start off with this video. This is what we call an impact video. So it is kind of emotional, and it really is targeting, why we do what we do and what we're in the business of trying to prevent.
I never knew what love was until I held you. Every day before you I was holding out. If you want the stars I can pull them down. Baby, in my arms you'll be safe and sound.
All right, so yeah, that's kind of where we're starting. Not all of the videos in the program are impact or as emotional as that. We use a variety of different approaches to make sure that we're kind of getting everyone who's affected, because not everyone is moved by that video. A lot are, and so we want to make sure we get that group, but a lot might not be as well. So that's why we use not only impact videos. But yeah, that's certainly an emotional one that makes me shed a tear when I see it. All right, so what does legalization really mean? So in Canada, the federal government sets the laws and controls all the various stages from seed to sale of cannabis, as well as setting federal rules of how much THC a driver can have in their system. The key thing that this slide is doing is demonstrating that though there are federal guidelines or rules that are set, there is also provincial changes there's always changes going on in the rules that can happen, but as well from province to provinces, there's also differences. And so it's important for folks to know that when crossing provincial borders, there can be changes in how much an individual could grow, how much they can possess, the age of possession. So let's say, you're delivering this presentation to somebody who has an 18-year-old kid. In one province, 18 might be fine, and they could have cannabis on them. And in another province like Quebec, they need to be 21. Don't quote me on that. I believe that law has been kind of like that rule has been up in the air with change, but to my understanding right now, it is 21 in Quebec. And so this is the thing, is that it does change these rules, and it also changes between provinces. So just important to keep in mind, though cannabis is legal, it doesn't mean that it doesn't come without conditions. So when is someone too high to drive? This is one of the biggest questions I get, because for many people, cannabis can give them the feeling of confidence, and they reason that, they've waited a few hours and they feel like they might be fine to drive after a period of time, or they didn't really have that much weed in the first place, or they have high tolerance, all these sorts of reasons that are excuses of why in their mind it would be okay to drive high. So here we're trying to really clarify that we want to disassociate any connection with like cannabis use and driving. So those are going to be two very separate activities. And if you choose to use, make your whole night/day, whenever you're using, about, that social aspect of your life or that, experience, and driving is going to be its own thing. And yeah, that way you don't have to play this game of like, oh, I'm not that high, I didn't have that much, and those sorts of things. So impaired is any use of mind altering substances. So when it comes to impairment, there's three ways we look at the way that affects us. There's manual impairment, cognitive impairment, and visual impairment. And all of these together lead to these sorts of types of impairments that, upon your own self-reflection, you may not be aware of or notice, but can be easier for somebody else to notice. Especially somebody who's a trained officer in detecting impairment, especially them. But these are all the kind of things that THC, that chemical in weed that gets someone high, these are all the things that it does when consumed. So someone might feel like, oh, weed doesn't affect me, but this is what it's designed to do. And that is forgetfulness, lack of judgment, slow reflexes, difficulty maintaining constant speed, feelings of euphoria, risk taking, easily distracted. Now, weed does differ from person to person, and the substance itself is incredibly different. You've got various strengths and potencies and ways to consume. So it's not certainly like everyone has the same experience with consumption, but these are all general outcomes of consumption. And though someone might consume and not experience, let's say, the feelings of euphoria, even just having forgetfulness, just one of these things is impairing your ability to operate the vehicle safely. So we're going to take a look at this Australian PSA. I will mention, actually, I just want to make a note of this, that this video should have a disclaimer on it. That's what I'm just making a note of. And it does have like a bit of a crash ending. So if you've been in a crash, this would not be something you'd maybe want to watch. But what I really like about this video, and that I think is so important, is the main character, the driver in the situation, seems totally fine. Like if I pass by this guy in the street, or if I was, at this social event that he's at, I would by no means think that he's out of his mind and can't drive. He's not stumbling or slurring his words, or all, he doesn't look like a mess. And I think that's just a really important thing to focus on as we watch this video, that when it comes to cannabis impairment, people don't look visibly, oops, sorry. People don't look visibly messed up.
Yeah, right. Yeah. How about you?
Don't know really.
Yeah, we were talking about maybe going down to the pub and seeing some bands or something, so...
Yeah, I might do that. Yeah, that sounds good actually. Who's playing?
Hey, Mark. Come on, we gotta get going.
Now? Can we stay a bit more?
No.
Yeah, alright, come on.
Yeah, alright. Gotta go.
See ya.
You got the keys?
Yeah. Woo! No, you got them. Bye. This is fun. God, she's so cute, Ella. She's like a really girls are very cute.
Whole based.
Me too. It's clear, babe. Oh. Are you sure you should be driving?
Yeah, fine.
All right, Mike, make up your mind. Is it fast or slow?
Okay, you drive.
So a bit of a shocking ending there, but I hope you kind of see that key point that I was talking about, is that we can't judge people on the outside, right? Like looking at Mark, um, you know, he didn't look like someone you were like, oh, let me take the keys away from this guy, right? And that's a really important thing, is to not judge people's impairment, based on the way that they look, because a lot of the impairments are going on inside someone's head. Okay, great. So someone's mentioning here a good point that I'm going to bring up. And I'll just read out the comment. I find a lot of chronic cannabis users say they've developed a tolerance and it doesn't impair them as it would others to new cannabis. Or sorry, others new to cannabis. Yeah, and that's a great point because I mean we all can understand how tolerance works, right? Like obviously you do develop a tolerance with chronic use, and the more you use and the increase in potency, it doesn't affect you in the same way it maybe once did. But my response to that fantastic question, which you definitely will get, is if it didn't affect you, if it didn't have some level of impact on your brain, you wouldn't be using it, right? Like the only reason why you use it is to feel something. And so though it might not completely mess you up and you're able to, do something that you normally do, you're not like out of it like as if you'd had a few shots or something. You're still getting an effect. And that effect is something that impairs driving ability for you to operate the vehicle at your best. All right, so let's take a moment and see how much you know about cannabis and driving. So this is an activity which you can have them answer, by raising their hands or shouting out an answer. I like to try and keep this one, as interactive as possible. So yeah, I mean it's just 5 questions. So alcohol and cannabis have different effects on the body, therefore they impair in different ways. So this answer here is true. So when it's correct and they answer correctly, it will come up with this like little happy face. Cannabis and alcohol both impair driving just differently, and we'll look at this more later. So this is just important because in the eyes of the law, impairment is kind of all seen quite similarly. Like there's not a strong difference in charges with impaired driving, regardless if someone is too tired or it's alcohol or it's cannabis or opioids or whatever the substance is. If you're impaired driving, that's the charge. And so legally it's all seen kind of the same, but we do have to acknowledge that a cannabis impaired driver is an incredibly different driver than an alcohol impaired driver, because an alcohol impaired driver would likely be going far too fast and be kind of radical or erratic in their driving and have very different behaviors, where a cannabis user tends to be much more calm and relaxed, often at point to a fault. Being high on weed can help you concentrate and make you a more alert/focused driver. So I'd put true here. Comes out as incorrect, and that's what it looks like, but it's the same text as if I had hit false. Now, I think a really important thing to acknowledge with this question, because it comes up a lot, that people truly do feel that it makes them more focused, is there is an ounce of truth to it. And that is that cannabis often gives people this thing called tunnel vision. And it's like driving with a hoodie. I like to say it like that. Like no one would really drive with a hoodie because it takes off your peripheral vision and blocks out what you're seeing on your sides, which is really important when you're driving because, someone could be swerving into your lane. There's all sorts of bad drivers and things that come up outside in that area that you need to prepare for. And having that tunnel vision, the riskiest thing is not that you're tuned out to your peripherals, but that it gives you the illusion that you're a better driver than you are. So this is why when someone is high, they often think that they're a really good driver, because this experience of tunnel vision gives them that perception of feeling more focused, more attentive. And that to me is one of the riskiest things about cannabis impaired driving. So just a key point when facilitating this slide, it is also in Weed Out the Risk, so you might already be familiar with it, but just the key point is when somebody says, oh yeah, that's true, like weed does make me more focused, you say, like that experience is true in and of itself, it does make you feel more focused, but there's a difference between perception and science. So yes, your feelings are valid, rather than just responding with, no, you're wrong, that's incorrect. Because I know that some facilitators, are used to just kind of answering this in a, yes, that's right, or no, that's wrong, rather than just being, no, you're wrong, just say your, feelings are valid, but here's the reality. It's safer to drive when you are burnt out than when you are high. So burnt out is that experience of being hung over. So it's a few a few hours after consumption. And a lot of people feel in this burnout phase, like a hangover, that they're safer to drive, that they're not as impaired. They're maybe vision is better than it was, their mind altered effects are lesser than. And so this is also similar to what I was saying with the tunnel vision, where you have this perception of being safer. And so this is what happens with a lot of high driving is it's people who are in that burnout phase. And that perception of being safer is quite risky because in reality, you are still impaired, just as with being hungover, even the next morning. If you're drinking too much Friday night, Saturday morning, you drive home thinking you've, ate some food, slept, it's been a number of hours. If you were like binge drinking or having overdoing it, then you're still impaired the next morning and can still be charged. Police can detect cannabis impaired driving and can charge you with impaired driving if you are found to be driving high. This one is true. You're going to get a lot of questions on this. There is a slide that goes into more depth on it, so you can address it here if you're getting questions or talk about it later. But the basic step-by-step process is first a roadside test. So an officer can conduct that, and there they determine whether or not you're fit to drive or you're impaired. Then if you fail the roadside test, then you go to the station and they have a DRE examine you. A DRE is a drug recognition expert. And a drug recognition expert is going to go through about a 2 hour, or it can be up to 2 hour examination, which includes taking a blood and urine sample. I know in some cases they might do saliva. It's kind of on and off, and it depends on which police station is doing it and whatnot. But they're basically just trying to keep up with the best technology. And they're saying right now that urine is kind of a better representation of recency of consumption. The blood sample is going to be used in court. And that is what's going to ultimately hold someone accountable for THC in their system. And that's determining the amount of THC per milliliters of blood. And they're just like alcohol with a breathalyzer, there's a certain level. It's 5 nanograms. And when you have over 5 nanograms per milliliters of blood, then that's when you're going to be charged with impaired driving. So the people who are most at risk of having that 5 nanograms or more are people who are chronic users. So if you're talking to folks who or are comfortable sharing with you that they do use regularly, you need to let them know that they are in that, risk category, of, like they have to be very careful to make sure that they're not like being pulled over and it's assumed that they're high, because if they fail that roadside test and then they end up having a high amount of blood, like THC in blood, per milliliter of blood in their system, it's going to put them in a bad position. And that's it for the quiz. Moving on to a variety of different vehicle types. Now, this is definitely important for adults because adults tend to travel a lot more than the kids do, and they could end up using a variety of different types of vehicles. So when we look at what vehicles you shouldn't use high, it's obviously anything with a motor. And we want to remind folks to look at the risks of impaired driving in the same way as they do with other vehicles, because it can be, if anything, riskier with these other vehicles. People tend to be more relaxed because they're using them in a more vacation type setting. Going to the cottage, going for a weekend getaway, traveling to another country, they feel like the rules kind of go out the window, and that's certainly not the case. And there's strong legal repercussions that can happen with using a motorized vehicle. The one question I get a lot is, what about a bicycle? And chances are, unless you're completely erratic in your biking, you're probably never going to be pulled over by a police officer for biking impaired. That said, we want to shift the thought process of being caught as not the high risk, but rather the other types of consequences, which is looking back at those values that we had discussed earlier. So if you were to be biking home, let's say, and you were really high and you were having your perception of like the potholes on the road being, an altered distance from you, and you weren't, biking properly or responding to things properly, then you could end up swerving into the car lane and, hitting a car. And then, the car would probably more so hit you. Like, you're putting yourself in a risky position. And obviously on a bike, you're much more vulnerable. So just keep that in mind. Though a bike doesn't have an engine, it doesn't maybe come with the same type of legal repercussions or chance of being caught. It has a much higher risk from like a perspective of life and death, right?
How would you feel if a school bus driver was high on the job? Or a cab driver? What about a truck driver? They wouldn't be, and neither should you when driving. Lives are at stake every time you get behind the wheel. Plan ahead. Don't drive high.
So just have that video to kind of demonstrate, thinking about things in a much more public safety perspective rather than just like getting caught. So why don't people think high driving is dangerous? So we wanted to put this in to just kind of really tackle the reasons why we are living in a society where a lot of people do think that, it's okay, and it hasn't been talked about because cannabis has been illegal and demonized and judged for a very long time. And so the conversation wasn't opened about, how it affects your driving. What are the consequences? Like, this whole conversation that we're having right now is something that would not have happened in such detail 10 years ago. So, this is new, and I thought that this was an important slide to put in. So the impairments from weed aren't usually associated with risky behaviors. That's valid, right? People think of a high person, they're more relaxed. And so they don't associate that with being dangerous on the road because, road rage is an issue. And so people don't think about, a relaxed driver being dangerous. Most Canadians aren't educated on the risks of cannabis impaired driving. So you're delivering to adults, which means, nowadays high school students have this program, but when these adults were in high school, they never received any of this education. I'm 30 and I remember being in high school 15 years ago, and the conversation was don't drink and drive, but I never received any information about don't drive high because weed was illegal and it never should have, like, the conversation just never came up because you shouldn't be smoking weed anyways. Most Canadians haven't heard the message don't drive high very much. So again, like, we've just heard that message don't drink and drive for years. And it's ingrained in a lot of people's mindset, but don't drive high is just new for folks. And many Canadians don't think that the police can identify a cannabis impaired driver. Obviously, the technology of a breathalyzer with alcohol brings in a lot of fear of getting caught for a driver because it's very easy to determine if someone's got alcohol in their system by simply taking a breath. Where with cannabis, a urine and blood sample, meeting with the DRE, having that roadside test, like, there's so many steps, and it's on a police officer's end much more challenging. So I get where, this mindset comes from, but it doesn't mean that they're not able to determine a cannabis impaired driver. All right. So I did have a good question come up talking about edibles and how it puts people at a higher risk. And that's a great question. It is something I believe that comes up. Yeah, so we just I'm going to put a pin in that because I don't want to talk about it and then I'm left blank on the slide. All right, so cognitive biases. So let's explore what cognitive biases can influence the decision to drive high. So at this point, folks have an understanding of why, there's been less education on cannabis impaired driving and whatnot, but they still might hold on to these biases that they've had for a while now, or for maybe decades if they've been driving high for years, about why they think it's okay. Because obviously, folks that are choosing to drive high have rationalized it in one way or another, and so we wanted to kind of tackle those things, and that's what we're doing in this slide. So first is the confidence bias. So I'm a really good driver. I'm a really good driver when high on, with high cannabis tolerance, so I will be okay. This I have found particularly true with young people, which is ironic because obviously they're novice drivers and they are definitely not the greatest drivers, but it's this mindset that I'm a great driver. Right. So the cannabis impairment doesn't affect me. It just brings me back to like a base, or like a middle ground of where like the average driver is, because they think they're that great. And that overconfidence is a risky thing to have. I've driven high before and nothing bad has happened, so I don't think driving high is risky. Especially with adults, they may have been driving high for years, like decades, and nothing bad has happened. They haven't gotten into a crash yet. Things haven't happened, and so that's what we call the anchoring effect. And the reality is that just because something bad hasn't happened before doesn't mean that it can't happen. And at the end of the day, you're putting like a public health issue on the table that doesn't need to be there, right? Driving high is already, or sorry, driving in and of itself sober is already a risky, to some degree, activity, right? A lot of deaths happen on the road from sober drivers, and adding to the mix of impairment is something that's, why add that in? Bandwagon effect. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. My friends, family, partner, right? People in your life, they don't think driving is dangerous, so neither do I. So it's just really common that you're going to take on the mentality that the people close to you around you do. And so if your friends and family don't think it's risky, chances are you won't either. But it's important that through this session, you kind of learn and develop the skill set to respond to impaired driving and to how cannabis impaired driving is risky, so that you can help inform your social circle if this is, something that you can relate to. Conservatism bias. So sure, I don't drink and drive. I've heard that message all my life. This new message of don't drive high, I'm reluctant to think that it is just as risky, right? So in this mindset, it's just the fact that something is new, this whole message of don't drive high, and that, that's sort of the impact that this one's having here.
I'm not stupid. I wouldn't drink and drive. She relies on me. They're counting on me. I'd never put them in danger. But I did. And it cost me everything.
Impaired boating is impaired driving.
All right, so when we were deciding to place that video, I had originally thought about putting it back with the previous slide on different types of vehicles, but in the end, I decided to put it here because I thought it made the most sense with talking about biases, right? Again, it's this sort of excuses that impaired drivers would give themselves. I might not drink and drive. I wouldn't put my family at risk, but having a beer on the boat isn't such a big deal. Or smoking weed and boating isn't as bad, those sorts of things. So that's where we start to see the biases affecting or infiltrating the mindset of, risky behaviors. So we move on to our workbook section. So you can turn to your workbooks, as you would say to your clients, and answer the following questions. So we're really trying to reflect here on the biases, because this is, the biggest barrier we have to creating an impact, concept with the program, right? Is when we finish the workshop, we want to make sure that the clients leave with a change of behavior. If, they choose to drive high, and even if they don't, that, they're ready and prepared to prevent impaired driving if they see it in their, social circle. But the biggest barrier that we have is either themselves or the people that they'd be connecting with holding on to these biases. So this is why we're focusing on the workbook here, at really tackling that. So what personal biases do I have when it comes to high driving? So we'll give them some time to answer that. And just, as you would deliver this session, explain to them that to respond to one question, don't read on to the next question until you've, fully answered the first one. And just a reminder, the question can be answered in a way that doesn't have to be through written form. It can be through drawing, any sort of expression that they want to put into the journal. What biases have I seen in my friends or family? And where may I have been mistaken about the risks of driving high? So this one, they can possibly reflect to their previous workbook question that was even back at what do I value most, and how would the things that I value be affected by impaired driving? If they said, I don't think there would be any effect. I don't think, my relationship with, my partner, let's say like my wife, would be affected if I, chose to drive high. Well, now at this point, after seeing that last video, for example, they might start to see that differently. And then this second question here, what biases have I seen in my friends or family? I think this is a really important one for them to think about, because if they do have friends and family with biases that, are pro driving high, this will help them kind of work out how they could start off that conversation of sharing what they've learned in this session. All right, so weed and its effects on the brain. Now that we know a bit about how people come to make decisions around impaired driving, let's take a look at how THC, that molecule that gets people high in weed, how it actually impairs our ability to operate a vehicle safely. THC affects our brain in three main areas that are absolutely necessary for safe driving: the basal ganglia, the hippocampus, and the cerebellum. So these are three regions of the brain that are heavily affected by cannabis use. Coincidentally, they're also three areas of the brain that are really important for driving. Now, to the earlier question that was brought up of, I, let's say, have high tolerance, I don't think weed affects me. Even though you feel like weed doesn't affect me or affect you, there's these three areas of the brain that are absolutely being influenced by cannabis use. So the basal ganglia is responsible for your muscle movement. So when our muscle movements and response times are slower, it makes it difficult to react quickly enough to keep ourselves and our passengers safe. So this one, and with all of these, I like to provide an example of how it's dangerous when your basal ganglia is impaired. So for this one, I provide the example of, let's say, an animal darted out onto the road, or a driver beside you started swerving into your lane. Maybe a health concern, maybe they're texting and driving or changing the radio station. For whatever reason, and something else, an external thing is coming in and influencing like your need to make a change in your driving. And it's really important that you have that quick reaction to respond to things. Hippocampus. So this is responsible for your short-term memory. When somebody smokes or eats weed, the short-term memory is reduced. And you might be wondering, well, I don't need short-term memory when I'm driving. Right, you might not think about that at first, but it actually is very important. It makes it difficult to concentrate, number one. It makes it difficult to remember where you're going. So a good, tell if someone's a high driver or how memory affects your ability to remember where you're going is, imagine that person driving on the highway and they forgot that they need to take this exit that they know they, take to get home. They take it all the time. It's routine in your mind. But when you're high, things that come naturally to you get slowed down. And so you would quite easily forget to take that highway exit. And then you're remembering too late and swerving, in to try and catch it before it's too late. So those sorts of interruptions and issues are things that come up with short-term memory impairment. And then the cerebellum is important for coordination. So that's all about changing lanes. An example of how your cerebellum gets affected is, let's say you are switching lanes, and normally you know that when you switch lanes, it's automatic for your brain to do the whole routine, right? Of checking your blind spots, signaling, checking all your mirrors, and doing that process. But when somebody is high, they're much more likely to check their blind spot and actually start turning the car. You know, that mistake that a lot of teenagers make or new drivers is really easy to do when someone's high, because that coordination, your brain's not connected in the same way it normally is. All right, how THC and other endocannabinoids affect the rest of your body. So endocannabinoids are naturally in your body, and your body is absorbing all of these right now as you're sitting watching this webinar, and it helps keep you balanced. By balanced, I mean it regulates your sleep, your mood, your appetite, and your memory, or just a few of the things that are really important systems going on in your brain that comes from your brain absorbing the endocannabinoids in your body. But of course, when somebody consumes THC, that molecule looks identical to endocannabinoids that are naturally in your body. So then you start absorbing the THC instead of your body's natural endocannabinoids. And that's why THC is impairing all these things. So weed has THC molecules, which has the same molecular structure of our body's endocannabinoids. So the THC replaces our body's natural endocannabinoids and disrupts the system. Does that make sense? How is everyone doing here? Are there any kind of questions or anything like that? All right, fantastic. So moving on now to edibles. I know this was brought up as a question earlier, so I'll go through this. So now we know about how THC impacts us, but how do these things change when THC is consumed through our digestive tract rather than the respiratory system? So there are three key things to know about edibles. I would never talk about edibles and miss these three things. Number one is the delayed onset. So let's say somebody's smoked weed before and they know the effects and they feel very familiar with how smoking weed affects them. And one thing they'll know is that within 5 minutes, they start to feel the peak effects. But with edibles, the issue is that sometimes you might not feel the effects for up to 2 hours. Now, to be honest, that's incredibly rare, but it can be that long. On average, it's about 30 to 45 minutes. Now, if someone is consuming edibles to get high, which obviously that's the reason why they're consuming it, is to feel something, and they're not feeling anything after 5 minutes, after 10 minutes, after 20 minutes, their natural reaction is going to be to consume more, thinking it's not working. So the delayed onset is important to know. Next is the potency is increased. So you have, instead of grams with the dried flower that people consume when smoking, the edibles are consumed in micrograms. So, or sorry, milligrams. So we have, for example, brownies, where normally I would eat a whole brownie because a brownie is delicious and that's a normal amount to eat. But if it had edibles in it, or if it had an amount of THC, you would not consume that in a normal way. You wouldn't eat a whole brownie. You might have a very small bite, and that could even get someone super high. Looking at the label when buying legally and being able to identify how many milligrams is right for you is incredibly important when experimenting, if it's your first time experimenting. Again, I use this example with the gummies. I would never eat half of a gummy bear. That's really weird. And, like, who would eat half of a gummy bear? But if it's an edible, that's actually quite normal to have half of a gummy bear. So because the potency is so strong in edibles, you consume them in very weird ways, or amounts, right? And that's low. And then finally, we have extended duration of impairment. This is important to know because with edibles, or sorry, with smoking, somebody might say, you know, I'm gonna smoke weed, let's say at this, you know, party or social gathering at 8 p.m. And the next morning, I'm gonna drive home. And with weed, I would, you know, if you're not overdoing it and using it to, you know, completely mess yourself up, then yeah, that is a very reasonable expectation. I would say you're, you know, basically safe to drive the next morning. That should be fine with, you know, a responsible amount consumed. But with edibles, that might not be the case. And I wouldn't plan to drive the next morning because if you overdo it, which is incredibly easy to do with edibles, then you could be in a position where you're still high the next morning. So just something to consider that the impairment can go up to 24 hours depending on how much you've consumed. Next is, and this is just like a side note, which is super important, always keeping these things out of reach of pets and kids. It's so important with the pets. It's just like, obviously they're going to want to eat edibles. Even the dried flower pets will eat, and it's obviously very terrifying for them, I'll say. Like, it's not a fun experience for an animal to be in. And then for kids as well, like these are, you know, small people, they are going to be heavily affected by these things. And if they see brownies, they cannot distinguish the smell that you and I might notice that is different about them, and they'll just, you know, consume the candy as they want.
A young man walks slowly along a roadside.
Jake took an edible,
The headlights of a car approach from behind him.
and now he thinks he's being followed
The car slows down next to him.
by his ride.
The driver smiles and waves at Jake. Jake looks nervous.
He'll figure it out eventually,
He keeps walking.
or not.
Words appear. If you do edibles, do anything but drive. caasco.com/cannabis.
So impaired driving is dangerous driving. Our brain and body need to be 100% to drive safely. Multitasking, as we are required to do while driving, can be a challenge when sober. So this is important to note, like, there is a lot of multitasking that people don't think about that you do when you drive. You know, you have to pay attention to who's around you. If the light is changing in front of you, monitor your speed, maybe carry on a conversation you're having in the car. There's a lot of things that, you know, you're switching to different functions very quickly. And being high makes that whole process much more difficult. I kind of relate it to, you know, when you're let's say looking for a house. Let's say you're going to a friend's house, but you haven't been there before, and you're driving down the street and you're looking for the house numbers. Kind of hard to see the numbers though, some of them are hidden and whatnot. So you've got the radio blasting, you've got someone in the car beside you, and you're looking for it, and then you find yourself starting to turn down the radio so you can concentrate, right? That process, you know, is demonstrating how one thing, though the sound has no influence on your ability to visually see the different house numbers and what you're looking for, it affects your concentration. And that analogy of the music is kind of similar to how I would explain weed. You know, you would never think of music as impairing your ability to drive, but it kind of does when you realize you've got to do other things. All right, so we've got another workbook moment or reflection. So great work so far. Let's take a moment to think about what we've learned. Reflect on what you've thought the dangers were before the workshop. What have you learned? So, you know, hopefully at this point, if they started out the workshop, which again, don't, you know, feel nervous if at the very beginning of the session they were adamant that driving high is not dangerous. Sure, maybe it's dangerous for kids, but not for adults. They're, you know, immune to the risks and whatever. That's okay to start there. That's a good thing. These are actually like the participants we want in the program, because we want to have changed mindset, not preaching to the choir. So hopefully by this point in the workshop, they've, you know, had a change of heart. And how has your understanding of the risks changed? You know, we really want to have them reflect on that. You know, we hope they start out the session being open-minded. So the decision to drive high can impact other people's lives. So again, here we're focusing less on legal consequences, financial consequences, but the impact it has looking at our decision making from a public safety perspective. Now, for sake of time, because I know it's almost 2 o'clock, I'm actually going to skip these videos. And I will say that they are like heavy impact stories. They're also on the longer side. I think both of these videos are just shy of 5 minutes, and they're the full story of a guy who was driving high. He ended up surviving the collision, but 5 of his friends were killed in this multi-car crash. And so it obviously had a devastating impact on the community, because this was in Canada, a small town, a small area outside of Ottawa. So, especially in these small town communities, that's a huge impact. So that's your real impact story there. But we do want to obviously go over the legal and financial consequences. So here we just have it listed out for them. So even before putting this up, a great strategy would be to ask them, what do you think are the legal consequences? And maybe having them as a group come together and write down a list and then share it. And if the list, is great, then you can just move on and say, okay, now what do you think the financial consequences are? And have them do the same thing. But if they're kind of struggling and they're not really sure how to answer and whatnot, you can click the card and it will just provide a list. Or once they have shared, if there's a few things they missed, then you can share this list. ASD device, it says fine for a failed ASD device. That is an assisted screening device. So that's usually how they refer to the saliva swabs. Almost half of drug-impaired driving fatalities involve cannabis. That's way too many preventable deaths on Canadian roads. All right, so this one is just kind of highlighting the fact that there are a lot of deaths from cannabis impairment. You don't hear about it on the news, and there's a few reasons for that. Number one is that cannabis impairment doesn't often come right away in the way that someone finds out. So, for example, if someone's been in a collision and let's say there's been a fatality or something, and the perpetrator who caused it, maybe a blood sample's taken, it might take a few days for the lab to come back with the results and say, yes, there was THC in the system. And these few days later, it's already out of the news story. So, and also the testing for cannabis impairment hasn't always been top of mind. So for a number of reasons, we just don't know about the true reality of how prevalent it is unless you look into the stats, as we've done. Then you can see how apparent it is. But yeah, it is unfortunate that a lot of people aren't aware of how often it happens. And it's just something that's completely preventable, right? All right, so moving back to the workbook, let's think back to the beginning of this module when you were asked what you value most in life. How do you think that driving impaired could impact the things you value most? So this is the last question in our workbook. And this is, the exact same question that we had in the very beginning. And this is, really important to hopefully have a change in answer. Even if, they did put down good answers in the beginning. So for example, they thought, okay, maybe, my relationships could be affected, or, maybe it could affect my job, but I'm not really sure how. By this point in the session, they would have a good understanding, like, okay, they know their car would be impounded, or they would lose their license, and so they can't drive to work. And so they would have a much more in-depth understanding of the consequences of cannabis impaired driving and how it would affect those things that they value most. So you'll just notice, I want to show you this, that I've been navigating through the workshop through hitting this forward and backward button, which is great because you'll go through every single slide ideally in the workshop, unless, something comes up and you lose some time in your session and you want to skip ahead. And if that's the case, you just hit these 3 lines in the middle here at the bottom, and it comes up with every single page. Eventually, these will all be titled. So for example, this one, page 22, will be titled workbook. reflecting on what matters to kind of help you navigate if you want to jump between slides. Yeah. All right, so now we're moving into a take-home practice as we start to wrap up the session. The take-home practice is an opportunity to reflect on the knowledge and skills learned in this module on your own upon module completion. Feel free to do the practice in a way that suits you best, anytime, as often as you would like. So the take-home practice is hoping that they will share what they know. So share something that you learned today with a family member or friend. What are 5 things you learned today that you would share with someone you know? This is really important, especially for them to share in the session, because one thing that we really want to end off the workshop with doing is setting out those brain pathways where this conversation becomes familiar to them. At this point, they may never have talked to their family or friends about the risks of impaired driving. And so having this moment where they're writing it down, they're practicing what they would say, writing out things that they've learned, is really helping them prepare how to engage in that conversation, something that is likely for most people going to be fairly nerve-wracking, especially if they're talking to someone who's been driving high for years and doesn't see anything wrong with it. So right now you're helping prepare them in that conversation. And when they share what they've written down, like I said, they're creating those brain pathways so that this is not the first time they're having that conversation. They've already practiced it in your session. And that is just going to be so helpful for them to have the confidence to start it off and to, help it, hopefully go well. And so you can kind of like bounce some ideas off them. For example, I've had people respond, with, I would just tell my friend that they're stupid for driving high, like it's such a stupid decision. And I always try to say to people, like, because though they might be very emotionally driven after the presentation and, talking about the issue, and that's how they want to engage with the conversation, as much as we want them to put it in their own words, that's obviously maybe they could use some guidance on how to start off that conversation in a bit more of a gentle way. So for example, if they see someone who wants to drive high, going up to that person and saying, hey, listen, like, I care about you. I don't want to see you get hurt. I don't want to see you hurt somebody else. Let me call you an Uber, let me look up the bus options. Like, maybe I could drive you if I'm sober, like helping that person out. So that's the key thing, is like, rather than going up to someone and telling them what to do, or, that they're what they are, like they're an idiot, or, that kind of language is just not a great way to start off the conversation. So yeah, I mean, I think it's so important to also provide your own example of what you would say in that situation, and having that, showing that leadership, I think is going to be really important to helping them feel more comfortable doing it. So yeah, just some things to consider for that take home that hopefully they do. And then our final thought is road safety is state of mind. Collisions are the absence of mind. And then we have a checkout. So what is one thing you will take with you from the session today? So they may have already kind of answered that in the previous question, but after listening to other people's answers, maybe they'll have something new. So anyways, this is, a great way for them to kind of take their own final thought, hopefully a slide or a fact, a memory from a video, something that stuck with them that, just saying out loud, I'm going to take with me this thing, just saying that will help them, continue the conversation.